The building is still half asleep when I swipe my badge at 5:47 a.m. The lights hum reluctantly, one by one, like they resent being woken before dawn. The air smells of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, the kind that promises hygiene and delivers headaches. For a moment, before the day claims me, the office belongs only to me and the quiet tapping of my shoes against the polished floor. By the time I reach my desk, the sky outside is the color of bruised steel. No sunrise yet. That comes later, usually when I no longer notice it. I turn on my computer. It groans like an old animal, slow to comply. My inbox is already full. Reports flagged urgent. Missed calls from yesterday evening. Follow-up reminders marked in red, bold, and increasingly aggressive punctuation. I haven't even taken my coat off, and I'm already behind. This is how every day starts. 12 hours in front of a screen, translating chaos into neat columns and bullet points. Other people's mistakes flow toward me like sewage toward a drain. Numbers that don't add up. Deadlines that were missed before they reached my desk. Angry clients who don't care whose fault it really is, as long as someone answers the phone and apologizes in a calm, professional voice. That someone is always me. By 8 o'clock, the office is full. Conversations rise and fall in waves, keyboard clatter, printers coughing out contracts, someone laughing too loudly near the coffee machine. I put on my headphones without turning on any music. Silence isn't allowed here, but the illusion of it helps. Mr. Collins passes my desk sometime before 9. Polished shoes, tailored suit, the faint scent of expensive cologne. He nods in my direction, a gesture stripped of warmth but heavy with expectation. You're here. Good. Keep being useful. I nod back. Reflex. Survival. The morning dissolves into tasks. I eat a granola bar from my drawer at 10, chasing it with tap water from the bathroom sink. Lunch is a luxury I stopped budgeting for months ago. Time, too. Both are in short supply. When my stomach growls, I remind it that rent is due in 9 days. Rent always comes first. At noon, sunlight finally reaches my window. It slides across the floor, pale and indifferent, touching everything except me. I don't move from my chair. Moving risks breaking the fragile rhythm that keeps me functioning. So I stay still, eyes burning, shoulders tight, fingers flying over the keyboard like they're not attached to the rest of my body. Calls blur together. I apologize. I promise solutions. I take responsibility for problems that were planted weeks ago by people who have already forgotten their names. Each call chips away at me, but slowly, so slowly that it feels normal. By 4 in the afternoon, fatigue settles behind my eyes like pressure before a storm. I stand to stretch and feel lightheaded, the room tilting for half a second. I grip the desk until it passes. There's still so much to do. Leaving early isn't an option. It never is. When the clock finally hits 6, the office begins to empty. Chairs slide back, bags are packed, voices soften. Someone says, "See you tomorrow," with genuine relief. I stay seated. My workload doesn't shrink just because the daylight does. Outside, dusk bleeds into night. Streetlights flicker on, one after another. I finish the last report at 7:42 p.m. My hands ache. My vision blurs when I look away from the screen. I shut the computer down carefully, as if any sudden movement might break something important. Me, mostly. I leave the building after dark, just like always. The city greets me with noise and cold air. Buses rumble past. Restaurants glow warmly, filled with people who still have energy to talk, to laugh, to eat meals that arrive on actual plates. I check my bank app while walking. Automatic habit. The number hasn't changed. It never does in a direction that matters. After rent, I can choose groceries or transportation. Not both. Some months, when something unexpected breaks or disappears, I choose neither and let hunger and long walks do their worst. At home, my apartment is quiet and mostly empty. Minimal furniture, no decorations, nothing that suggests permanence. I drop my bag, kick off my shoes, and sit on the edge of the bed without turning on the light. I've been living like this for so long that it no longer feels temporary, just adjustable. One more month. That's the thought I fall asleep with. One more paycheck. One more compromise. One more stretch of 12 hours that I survive. I don't know yet that the next month will change everything. For now, all I know is that tomorrow, before dawn, I'll swipe my badge again. I spent 3 days rehearsing the conversation in my head, not the dramatic version where I slammed my resignation letter onto the desk and walked out lighter, freer. That fantasy never lasted long. Reality was quieter, uglier. It involved numbers, rent increases, utility bills, the simple, humiliating truth that 12 hours a day still wasn't enough to survive. On the 4th morning, I woke up with the decision already made. My chest hurt in that dull, compressed way it does when fear has settled in for the long haul. I dressed carefully, choosing neutral colors, ironing a shirt that no longer fit my shoulders the way it used to. I looked tired in the bathroom mirror, older than last year, definitely older than I felt inside. Stress has a way of accelerating time. Mr. Collins arrived at precisely 8:30, as he always did. Predictable, controlled. He liked that about himself. I waited until 10:15 to knock on his door, late enough that he'd already gone through a few emails, early enough that he wouldn't claim he was too busy. My knuckles hovered in the air a second longer than necessary before I knocked. "Come in," he called. His office was a different world from the rest of ours. Thicker carpet, real wood desk, a window that actually opened. The smell of coffee here was fresh, not burned. He didn't look up right away, finishing a note on a file before lifting his eyes to me. "Yes," he said, neutral, assessing. "I need to talk to you," I said. My voice surprised me by not shaking. He gestured to the chair across from him. I sat, folding my hands tightly in my lap. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He waited. He was good at that. Silence as pressure. "I'll be direct," I said finally. "My salary isn't enough anymore. I can't afford my apartment, and I can't keep working these hours without some adjustment." There it was. The sentence I'd been afraid to say out loud. Once it existed in the room, it felt smaller than I expected. Still terrifying, but solid. Mr. Collins leaned back in his chair. He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on my face, not in a professional way, not even an openly hostile one. He studied me like he was deciding which shelf to put me on. The seconds stretched. I became acutely aware of every detail. The faint ticking of a wall clock, the soft whir of his computer fan, the pressure of my shoes against my toes. Finally, he smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile you give an employee who's struggling. It didn't reach his eyes. It was slow, considered, as though the conversation had taken an interesting turn. "You know," he said, "a lot of people would be grateful to have your position." "I am," I replied. "That's why I'm here asking instead of leaving." He nodded, as if conceding a point in a game only he knew the rules to. "Budgets are tight," he said. "You understand that?" "I do," I answered, "but understanding doesn't lower my rent." That seemed to amuse him. A faint chuckle escaped his lips. He leaned forward this time, resting his elbows on the desk, fingers interlaced. "In the office," he said slowly, "there really isn't much room to maneuver." My stomach dropped. I had expected resistance. I had prepared myself for disappointment. What unsettled me was the way his tone shifted. Too warm, too personal. But, he continued, tilting his head slightly, there may be another option. I didn't speak. I let him talk. Something in my chest tightened, instinctively alert. He stood up and walked toward the window, his back to me, like this was a conversation that required dramatics. Outside, the city moved on, blissfully unaware of my life hanging in the balance. "You're reliable," he said. "Efficient. Discreet." The last word landed strangely. "I appreciate that," I said cautiously. He turned back to me, smile still in place, eyes sharper now. "Let's just say," he continued, "that sometimes opportunities exist outside standard channels." I understood then why this conversation had always felt wrong in my imagination, why my body had resisted it. My heart was beating too fast, my palms damp. "What kind of opportunity?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment, like he was enjoying the suspense. Then he shrugged lightly, as if the next sentence meant nothing at all. "Well," he said, "I might have ways to supplement your income." The air felt heavier. Words crowded my throat, unsaid questions piling up. How? In exchange for what? Why does this feel like a trap? "I'm listening," I said, because fear has a way of disguising itself as politeness. His smile widened, just a fraction. "Good," he replied. "I thought you would." I left his office 10 minutes later with nothing resolved and everything changed. As the door closed behind me, my legs felt unsteady. I returned to my desk and stared at my screen without seeing it. I had asked for help. What he'd offered wasn't help at all. And somewhere deep down, beneath the anxiety and exhaustion, I knew this wasn't over. He didn't call me back in immediately. That was deliberate. Mr. Collins understood the power of waiting, how uncertainty gnaws at people, how silence can make you rehearse obedience before anyone asks for it. For the rest of the day, I worked mechanically, my mind drifting back to his words, replaying them from different angles, searching for meanings I didn't want to find. Supplement your income. By the time my phone vibrated at 6:12 p.m., the office was nearly empty. I watched the screen light up with his name, my pulse jumping despite myself. I didn't answer right away. I counted to 5, letting my breath settle, then picked up. "Yes?" "Come upstairs," he said. "We should finish our conversation." Not continue. Finish. His office looked different in the evening. The overhead lights were dimmer, the city outside reduced to reflections on glass. He was no longer behind his desk when I walked in. Instead, he leaned against it, sleeves rolled up, jacket draped carelessly over a chair. He gestured for me to sit again. I didn't. "I don't have much time," I said. It wasn't true, but it sounded like leverage. He smiled faintly. "I'll be brief." For a second, I thought he might soften, that maybe I'd misread everything. Then he spoke. "I have a house," he said, as if that alone was a revelation. "Big place. Too big, frankly. Hard to keep up with." I waited. "Sometimes," he continued, "I need help. Small things. Evenings, mostly. Dishes. Tidying up. Nothing complicated." There was a pause. Not accidental, not short. "You could come by," he added. "Help around the house. I'm a generous man." The word generous rang too loudly in the space between us. I felt cold spread through my chest, slow and creeping. Not panic yet. Disgust, maybe? Or clarity? He watched my reaction closely now, eyes tracking the smallest shift in my expression. This wasn't an offer tossed out carelessly. This was something he'd done before. "How generous?" I asked. He chuckled. More than what you're making now, for far less effort. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. I suddenly noticed the way he stood too close, how his gaze lingered too long on my face, my posture, my stillness. "And the dishes?" I said. "That's all?" Another pause. "Longer this time?" "Let's not pretend to be naive," he replied gently. "You're smart. You know how these things work." There it was, the unspoken sentence filling the room, heavy and obscene. It crawled under my skin, settling there. I nodded slowly, not in agreement, but to show I understood. He mistook it for surrender. "This wouldn't interfere with your job," he went on. "In fact, it might secure it." Threat, wrapped in reassurance. "I didn't realize that was necessary," I said. "It isn't," he replied, smiling again. "Unless you want it to be." My hands curled into fists at my sides. I became acutely aware of my breathing, the tension in my jaw. Part of me wanted to laugh, a sharp, hysterical sound. Another part wanted to leave immediately, to scrub myself clean of the implication hanging between us. Instead, I asked, "When?" He raised an eyebrow. "You're considering it?" "I need to understand what you're suggesting," I said carefully, "before I say anything else." He straightened, clearly pleased. "This evening help," he repeated. "Discretion. That's important to me." "But the dishes," I said again deliberately. "That's just your opening line, isn't it?" His smile thinned, just enough to show annoyance. "Call it whatever makes you comfortable." That was the moment it crystallized. The realization didn't arrive dramatically. It settled like a final piece clicking into place. It was never about the dishes. This wasn't charity. It wasn't flexibility. It was an exchange he assumed I was desperate enough to accept. Rent, groceries, dignity, all weighed carefully against what he believed I could be convinced to give up. "I'll think about it," I said. "Of course you will," he replied smoothly. "Take tonight." I left without shaking his hand. The hallway seemed longer than usual as I walked away. My reflection in the darkened windows looked unfamiliar, smaller, tighter, coiled with something I couldn't yet name. Anger, maybe, or resolve. By the time I stepped outside, night had fully taken over. The city hummed around me, indifferent and alive. Cars passed. People laughed somewhere nearby. I stood still for a moment, breathing in cold air, grounding myself. He thought this was settled. He thought I understood my place. He was wrong. I didn't go home right away. I wandered the streets without direction, letting the city swallow me up. Neon signs flickered overhead. Taxi horns cut through the night. Everyone seemed to be moving toward something, a dinner, a bed, another person, while I drifted between blocks like a ghost with a temporary body. Humiliation is a strange emotion. It doesn't explode. It seeps. It crawls into places you didn't know existed and sits there, quiet and corrosive. Mr. Collins hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened me directly. He hadn't even touched me. And yet, I felt violated all the same. Because he hadn't asked. Not really. He had assumed my desperation, weighed it against his power, and decided the outcome without my consent. To him, it wasn't immoral. It was efficient. A transaction. One more problem solved behind a closed door. I eventually made my way back to my apartment. The hallway light flickered as I unlocked the door, casting uneven shadows on the walls. Inside, the silence greeted me like an accusation. No television, no background noise, just the sound of my own breathing. I dropped my bag and leaned against the door, closing my eyes. "You don't have a choice," his voice echoed in my head, even though he'd never said those exact words. He didn't need to. The implication had been clear enough. I walked through the apartment slowly, touching the back of the chair, the kitchen counter, the chipped edge of the table. Everything I owned was here, and none of it was worth much. The place smelled faintly of detergent and cold air. It didn't look like a home. It looked like something temporary I'd overstayed in. I stood in the center of the living room and tried to imagine myself complying. Evenings at his house, polite smiles, silence bought with money, hands steady while something inside me eroded a little more each night. The image made my stomach turn. Anger rose next, not loud, not explosive, but sharp and focused. It surprised me with its clarity, because beneath the fear and shame was something else. Certainty. He thought I was weak. He thought I was cornered. He thought survival meant submission. I sat down on the floor, my back against the couch, knees pulled to my chest. For a moment, I let myself feel it all, the exhaustion, the resentment, the disgust at how easily my autonomy had been reduced to an option. Then I started thinking, not imagining escape, not fantasizing about revenge, just thinking, slowly and methodically, the way I did at work when faced with an impossible mess of numbers. People like Mr. Collins relied on patterns, on predictability, on the belief that those beneath them were too tired, too afraid, or too grateful to look closely. That belief was his mistake. I replayed the scene in his office, not emotionally this time, but analytically. The confidence, the lack of caution, the way he'd spoken as if the world were already arranged in his favor. People like that always left traces. I stood and went to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. I looked up at the mirror and barely recognized myself. My eyes were sharper now, my jaw set with unfamiliar resolve. If he thinks I'm a victim, I said aloud, testing the words, he's wrong. The sound of my voice steadied me. I didn't sleep much that night, but not from panic. My mind was too busy reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity. Fear still existed, but it no longer drove everything. It took a back seat to intention. By morning, the decision was made. I would go back. Not because I accepted his terms, but because I would redefine them. He believed the deal was already done. That confidence was dangerous, but not for me. As I locked my apartment behind me and headed to work, exhaustion tugged at my limbs, but something else kept me upright. A cold, deliberate calm. I wasn't walking into a trap. I was stepping into a room where he thought he held all the power. And that was exactly where I needed to be. I slept less than 2 hours, but I woke with a clarity that cut through exhaustion like ice through dull water. There was no debate left in my head, no back and forth. Fear still existed, but it had been demoted. It no longer led the conversation. The city looked different that morning, sharper, more honest, as if everything had dropped the pretense of comfort and revealed its true framework. Systems built on leverage, survival exchanged for compliance. I wasn't special. I'd just finally seen the mechanism clearly. I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The badge scanner beeped softly, the same sound it always made, but this time it didn't feel like a countdown starting. It felt like a door opening. I worked efficiently until 10, finishing enough tasks that no one could accuse me of neglect later. Documentation mattered. It always did. When the clock hit 10:30, I stood up and walked to Mr. Collins's office without knocking. He looked up, surprised, then pleased. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair. "That was fast." I closed the door behind me quietly. I didn't sit. "I've thought about it," I said. My voice was steady, almost flat. "And I'm willing." He smiled immediately, a satisfied proprietary expression. He gestured toward the chair again, confident now, but I raised a hand. On my terms. That stopped him. The smile hesitated, recalibrated. I'm not sure I follow. I will help you, I continued calmly. In the evenings, outside office hours. But this is strictly transactional. Money only. No favors, no ambiguity. He studied me closely, irritation flickering at the edges of his composure. You're getting ahead of yourself. No, I said. I'm catching up. I finally took the chair, but I sat forward, elbows on my knees, not relaxed, not submissive, engaged, professional. I'm paid up front, I said. Every time, cash or transfer before I set foot in your house, and I decide when I leave. His eyes narrowed. You're forgetting who you're talking to. I know exactly who I'm talking to, I replied. That's why I'm being precise. Silence filled the room again, thicker this time. He didn't like being interrupted in his fantasies of control. I could see it. The subtle tightening of his jaw, the slight twitch in his fingers. And if I refuse? He asked. Then I thank you for your time, I said evenly, and we both pretend this conversation never happened. Something shifted. Not in his power, he still had plenty of that, but in the calculation. He hadn't expected resistance. He'd expected negotiation at most, not boundaries drawn this cleanly. He leaned forward. You think you're in a position to bargain? I think, I said, meeting his gaze, that you prefer discretion, and I'm offering it. The word landed exactly where I intended. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. Not fear, men like him rarely felt that, but awareness. Awareness that this wasn't unfolding the way he'd scripted it. He exhaled slowly, then smiled again. This time, it was sharper. Very well, he said. Paid up front. And one more thing, I added. What happens outside of work stays outside of work. No changes to my responsibilities. No references to this arrangement. Ever. He nodded, almost amused. You're thorough. I have to be. Another pause. Then he stood, extending his hand. Tonight, he said. I looked at the hand for a moment before shaking it. His grip was firm, deliberate. Ownership disguised as agreement. Tonight, I echoed. I left his office knowing he thought he'd won. That was fine. People like Mr. Collins didn't understand one simple thing. Once you stopped trying to protect your dignity at all costs, you could use their arrogance against them. He believed I'd folded my principles neatly and put them away for money. In reality, I'd just reorganized them. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine. Emails, calls, small talk that felt increasingly hollow. No one noticed the quiet transformation underway. To them, I was still the same exhausted employee pulling long hours. At 6:45 p.m., my phone vibrated. An address, a number, no greeting. I checked my account 10 minutes later. The money was already there, more than my weekly paycheck. I stared at the screen, not with relief, but with confirmation. He truly believed this was a simple exchange. As I left the office that night, the air felt cooler, heavier with possibility. I wasn't walking into submission. I was walking into enemy territory, and I intended to learn everything. His house sat at the edge of one of those neighborhoods people describe with a lowered voice. Quiet streets, trimmed hedges, security signs that advertised paranoia as luxury. The kind of place where nothing ever looked wrong, which only meant no one looked closely. I arrived exactly on time. Early would have seemed eager. Late would have implied uncertainty. I stood on the smooth stone path leading to the front door and took in the details the way I'd trained myself to do at work. Neutral expression, heightened awareness, Cameras were subtle but present. Small black orbs disguised near motion lights, one above the garage, another tucked into a decorative corner near the entrance. Not hidden, displayed. A warning and a boast. The door opened before I knocked. "You're punctual," Mr. Collins said, stepping aside to let me in. "So are you," I replied, noting that he'd already changed out of his work clothes. Casual, expensive, deliberately relaxed. The interior matched the exterior, immaculate to the point of sterility. Everything had its place. Nothing suggested real living. White countertops, stainless steel appliances, floors so clean they reflected light like still water. Cleaning supplies stood neatly arranged under the sink, unused. Irony in its purest form. "Kitchen's through there," he said, gesturing vaguely. "Make yourself comfortable." I nodded and walked in without waiting for further instruction. The sink held exactly 3 plates, 2 glasses, and cutlery aligned as if stacked for display rather than use. He didn't cook. Or if he did, someone else cleaned up afterward. I rolled up my sleeves. The first evening passed without incident. That in itself was information. He stayed in the living room, occasionally glancing at his phone or laptop, pretending disinterest while watching me through reflective surfaces. Glass cabinets, polished metal, anything that allowed observation without the vulnerability of direct eye contact. I moved calmly, methodically, water temperature adjusted, soap measured, each gesture deliberate. This wasn't submission, it was reconnaissance. I noticed documents left casually on the kitchen island. Not personal, business-related, financial summaries, a folder marked Q4 revisions. He hadn't bothered to put them away. Arrogance or certainty that no one around him would dare look. I looked. Not obviously, not greedily, just enough to register names, numbers, anomalies, things that didn't align with the clean narrative of his professional image. When the dishes were done, I dried my hands and turned to him. "I'm finished," I said. He glanced at the clock. "Already?" "There wasn't much," I replied. Another small miscalculation on his part. He'd imagined longer evenings, extended presents, time to blur boundaries. Instead, the task concluded too efficiently. He hesitated, then waved a hand. "You can go." No attempt to stop me. No pressure. Not tonight. He was testing me, gauging how pliable I was. I let him believe the silence meant acceptance. The payment notification arrived before I reached the end of the street. Over the next evenings, patterns emerged. His schedule was careless. Meetings noted on physical calendars. Calls taken on speaker. Passwords entered without shielding the screen. Once, he left his phone on the counter when he stepped out to take a call in the other room. No lock. No concern. I memorized everything. The camera angles, the blind spots. Which lights triggered motion sensors and which didn't. His habits, when he drank, when he grew distracted, when he assumed no one was paying attention. He talked too much. Not directly to me, not at first, but at me. Commentary disguised as small talk. Complaints about regulators, about audits, about people who didn't know their place. He never named names, but he didn't need to. His resentment filled the spaces between words. I nodded when appropriate, said little. Silence made people reckless. One evening, while wiping down the counter, I noticed an open laptop on the desk adjacent to the kitchen. An email preview visible from where I stood. A subject line caught my attention. Amended filings, delete prior version. He returned too soon for me to read more. I lowered my eyes, resumed cleaning, filed the detail away. Each night, I left on my terms. Never stayed longer, never lingered. He disliked that. I could see it in the tightening of his smile, the way his gaze followed me to the door. "You're very efficient," he remarked one night. Not a compliment, an observation. "I was hired to be," I replied. The house itself began to feel like a staged photograph. No dust, no warmth, no evidence that anyone lived honestly there. Every perfect surface hid something beneath it. Cracks you could hear if you listened closely enough. By the end of the week, my fear had entirely evaporated. In its place was focus. He believed he'd purchased access. What he didn't realize was that he'd invited scrutiny into his private space. He'd handed me time, visibility, and opportunity in exchange for money he assumed would blind me. Every evening I washed dishes that barely needed washing, and every evening I learned something new. The house wasn't as clean as it looked. Neither was he. By the second week, I no longer needed to consciously observe. The house had begun to map itself inside my head. Every creak, every shadow, every reflection had a place. Familiarity is dangerous like that. It makes arrogance grow. His, not mine. Patterns harden when people believe they're unseen. Mr. Collins grew more relaxed with every visit. He poured himself drinks earlier in the evening, left papers out without even pretending to organize them. Once, he laughed openly while talking on the phone about a subcontractor who would never go to the authorities. Too much to lose. He didn't notice me until I set a glass down a little too loudly. He waved me off. "Don't mind me." I never did. The documents told a story long before I ever pieced it together consciously. Once you know how numbers should behave, incorrect ones stand out like bruises on pale skin. Adjusted totals, duplicate expenses routed through shell vendors, payroll entries that didn't correspond to actual employees, ghosts. Then there were the names. I wasn't the first. That became painfully obvious. Drawer dividers held business cards, consultants, assistants, contractors, but some were personal. Handwritten numbers, notes scribbled in the margins. One card in particular stood out, folded twice, edges worn. A woman's name, no last name, just evenings only. I felt a familiar twist in my stomach, but it wasn't fear this time. It was recognition. Other girls. Not employees, not officially. Services wrapped in euphemism. Compliance bought quietly, kept off the books in the same way everything else was. I wondered what had happened to them. How many took the money and disappeared? How many stayed longer than they intended? How many broke before they realized they were never supposed to win? I watched him more closely after that. He slipped sometimes, complaints muttered under his breath, casual insults disguised as jokes. There was contempt in the way he spoke about people who needed things, renters, interns. Anyone who existed one rung below him on the ladder, he imagined himself climbing endlessly. "You should be grateful," he said one night, apropos of nothing. "Not many people get opportunities like this." I looked up from the sink. "Opportunities?" He smiled lazily. "Flexibility. Understanding." I dried my hands slowly. Understanding goes both ways. For a brief second, something like suspicion crossed his face. Then it passed. He laughed, dismissing it as harmless independence. That was his greatest flaw. He believed control was permanent. That once established, it never needed maintenance. The phone was the worst of it. He left it everywhere. Countertops, sofas, the bathroom sink, no password. Facial recognition disabled because it had once failed after he'd had dental work done. A story he told twice, chuckling both times. That's how I saw the messages. Encrypted apps, yes, but also plain SMS, because he believed obscurity was unnecessary. Account summaries sent by intermediaries, Short confirmations, done, cleared, delete after reading. One message froze my breath entirely. A forwarded document. A signature that wasn't his. Forgery wasn't just implied anymore. It was documented. I didn't take photos. I didn't copy files. Not yet. I memorized dates, names, structures, the logic of how money moved and why no one had complained. Because those who noticed were compensated, and those who weren't never saw the full picture. One evening, he drank too much. His confidence loosened into sloppiness. He sat at the kitchen island watching me clean, eyes too sharp, smile too lazy. "You're different," he said. I didn't respond. "Smarter than the others," he continued. "They always thought they were clever. Emotional, though. That's why they failed." "Failed at what?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He shrugged. "Understanding how the world works." I almost laughed. Instead, I finished drying the last plate and set it down carefully. "You should lock your phone," I said casually. His eyebrows rose. "What?" "Security," I added. "You always complain about people being careless." For a fraction of a second, the room went perfectly still. Then he laughed. Loudly. Too loudly. "Paranoia is part of success," he said, though his hand went instinctively to the counter where his phone lay face up. That night, I walked home under a sky heavy with clouds and realization. What he'd built wasn't just illegal, it was fragile. Propped up by silence, by people convinced they were isolated incidents instead of a pattern. He wasn't invincible. He was loud, careless, surrounded by evidence because he believed evidence only mattered if someone dared collect it. I stopped asking myself if this would end badly for him. I started planning how. He thought I was cleaning dishes. In reality, I was documenting a life built on theft and coercion, waiting for the moment when the truth would no longer be silent. The mess was far deeper than I'd expected, and it was finally ready to surface. That night, everything felt slightly off, as if the house itself knew it was approaching the end of the performance. The air was heavier, carrying the smell of impending rain. Clouds pressed low against the sky when I arrived, muting the neighborhood's carefully curated calm. Mr. Collins opened the door already smiling, already relaxed in the way people are when they believe the outcome is locked in. "You're late," he said lightly. 2 minutes, I replied, still within my terms. He chuckled and stepped aside. "Always precise." Inside, the house was brighter than usual. Too bright. Every overhead light was on, illuminating perfect surfaces that no longer fooled me. I could see the flaws now. Microscopic scratches on the counter, dust trapped in corners cameras never covered, fingerprints smudged where control had slipped. The sink was empty. No dishes, no glasses, nothing to justify my presence. "I cleaned earlier," he said, watching my reaction closely. "Thought we might talk tonight." I paused only briefly before setting my bag down. My pulse remained steady. If this was the confrontation, so be it. I'd already crossed the point of fear. "We can talk," I said, "but I'll still be leaving on time." He poured himself a drink, the ice clinking softly against the glass. "You always do," he said. "That's one of the things I admire about you." Admire. Another word repurposed until it meant ownership. He leaned against the counter, closer now than usual, confidence spilling past subtlety. "You know," he continued, "most people would have tried to leverage what they saw here by now." I met his gaze. "I'm not most people." "No," he agreed. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You're more disciplined." The remark hovered between us like a wire pulled taut. I moved to the sink anyway, wiping an already clean surface with a cloth just to maintain the ritual. Control came from routine, from pretending nothing had changed when everything had. "You've been very quiet," he said. "Observant." I shrugged. "You pay me to work, not to talk." "Yes," he said slowly. "I pay you." There it was, the reminder, sharpened and deliberate. Something in his expression shifted then. A flicker of irritation. He wasn't getting what he wanted tonight. Not reassurance, not submission, not gratitude. "You know," he said, circling closer, "I've taken a risk letting you come here." "And I've taken a risk accepting," I replied. He laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it. "Don't confuse inconvenience with risk." I turned to face him fully. "Don't confuse money with control." Silence dropped hard and final. For a moment, I thought he might lash out. Not violently, but verbally, emotionally. That was his language of power. Instead, he stepped back, reassessing. He prided himself on restraint, on knowing when to retreat. "You're done for tonight," he said flatly. I nodded. "So it seems." I picked up my bag. As I did, I glanced once, briefly, toward the desk. The laptop sat there, open and unlocked. A spreadsheet filled the screen. Names, transfers, dates. He followed my gaze, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something real in his eyes. Alarm. "Careful," he said quietly. "I always am," I replied. I walked to the door without rushing, without looking back. My phone vibrated as I stepped outside, the payment already sent. He still believed money was punctuation, full stop, conversation over. By the time I reached the gate, rain had started to fall, light at first, then harder. I welcomed it. Let it soak into my hair, my clothes, wash the night from my skin. There were no dishes left to clean. I had already taken what I needed. Not files, not photos, not proof in the traditional sense. I had taken understanding, structure, certainty. All that remained was execution. As thunder rolled faintly overhead, I smiled for the first time in weeks. The house lights glowed behind me, oblivious and exposed. Inside, Mr. Collins still thought the arrangement was intact. He had no idea this was the last evening I'd ever step into his world. It didn't happen all at once. Justice never does. It moves in stages, quietly at first, like a shift in air pressure that most people ignore until the storm breaks windows. The first sign was an email. Subject: request for documentation. Immediate response required. Sent at 9:03 a.m. By 9:17, Mr. Collins was standing in the corridor outside his office, phone pressed to his ear, voice carefully neutral and failing. I watched from my desk, screen untouched, hands folded as if I were waiting for instructions. People always say you can recognize fear when you see it. That's not true. Fear is messy. This was something cleaner. Calculation breaking down. By noon, the building felt different. Whispers threaded between desks. Doors closed more often than usual. At 1:40 p.m., two unfamiliar men in dark suits walked past reception, badges clipped neatly to their jackets. Inspectors, the kind who don't smile. They didn't look at me. They went straight to his office. The door closed. Locked. Silence spread like spilled ink. No one worked. We pretended to, hands hovering over keyboards, eyes darting toward the hallway. Time slowed, thick and viscous. At 3:12, the police arrived. That one was harder to miss. Blue uniforms, official expressions, real consequence. Someone gasped. Someone else swore quietly. I stayed seated. When they emerged hours later, carrying boxes and sealed folders, Mr. Collins was gone. Not escorted, removed. His office door was marked and padlocked. A printed notice taped neatly over the handle. Business as usual was over. They asked me to step into a conference room the following morning. I said yes without hesitation. The questioning was thorough, professional, unemotional. They didn't treat me like a victim or a hero. They treated me like a witness, someone who had paid attention. What did you see? What do you remember? When did you notice inconsistencies? I answered calmly. Dates, behaviors, patterns, no speculation, just facts. They didn't ask why I stayed. They already knew. By the end of the week, the office was hollow. People reassigned, files redistributed, authority diluted into corporate distance. Mr. Collins's name stopped appearing in emails altogether, then in hallway conversations, then anywhere, as if he'd never been there. One of the investigators paused as I gathered my bag on the final day. "You're willing to testify if needed?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Why?" I thought about it for a moment, not because I doubted the answer, but because I wanted to give the right version of it. "Not for revenge," I said finally. "For accountability." He nodded. He'd heard many answers. This one satisfied him. I went home earlier than usual that night. The sun was still up. I stood in my apartment doorway for a long time, absorbing the unfamiliar feeling of space that wasn't filled with dread. The roles had shifted. He no longer decided when I entered a room. He no longer decided what silence cost, and the power he'd worn so carelessly, like a status symbol, had collapsed under its own weight. All that work, all those secrets, gone. I didn't give notice. After everything happened, after the sealed office and the hushed voices and the sudden corporate emails full of transitions and temporary measures, I simply stopped going back. HR sent me a polite message asking to discuss next steps. I replied just as politely that I had already taken them. 2 weeks later, I signed a contract with a different company. Fewer hours, a smaller office, a manager who looked me in the eye when speaking and never closed the door behind me. The first day, I kept waiting for something to go wrong, for the familiar knot in my stomach, for the invisible pressure that had lived under my skin for so long I'd mistaken it for normal. It never came. I left work at 5:30 and stepped into daylight like it was something new. I bought groceries without calculating which items I'd have to put back. I took the bus home instead of walking for 40 minutes. That night, I cooked an actual meal and ate it sitting down. Safety, I learned, feels quiet. Sometimes, memories still surface. That first conversation. The way Mr. Collins had leaned back in his chair, certain the world bent naturally toward his advantage. The tone he used when he said the dishes, as if reducing me to a task made the price of obedience easier to swallow. For a long time, I'd believed silence was the cost of survival. That endurance meant absorbing whatever came my way as long as I stayed functional. I'd confused resilience with disappearance. I know better now. Silence doesn't protect you. It protects the person who benefits from it. I testified 6 months later. Clear, unemotional, precise. His lawyer tried to frame my involvement as consent, as opportunism. The attempt failed quickly. Facts have a way of dismantling narratives built on entitlement. I wasn't the only witness. There never is just one. When it was over, I walked out of the courthouse and felt lighter. Not triumphant, not vengeful, just finished. A chapter closed cleanly, without regret. Justice isn't loud. It simply exists, firm and undeniable, once the truth is spoken often enough. Sometimes I still think about that evening when I stood in my apartment, exhausted and shaking, convinced I had no way out. About how close I came to believing him, to letting his version of the world overwrite mine. If I had stayed silent, he would have broken me. Instead, I paid attention. I stayed aware. I chose intention over fear. Now, when I walk into an office, I don't scan for exits. I don't calculate what I owe for existing in the space. I do my work. I'm paid fairly. I leave when the day is done. And when I look back, I don't see 12-hour days or empty refrigerators or spotless kitchens that hid decay beneath their shine. I see the moment I stopped letting someone else define my worth. I don't stay silent anymore.